Hi, good evening. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum, and we're here in the museum and also welcoming people online to this program tonight, which is part of our monthly book talks. Tonight we have Howard Husock and also in conversation with Nicholas Bloom, and I'll introduce them in a moment, talking about Howard's new book, which is The Projects, New History of Public Housing. And this is kind of an odd topic, maybe, for people for the Skyscraper Museum, but it's a topic that we looked at in a past exhibition. And as it happens, Nicholas Dagan Bloom, was the guest curator for that show, along with Matthias Altwicker. And it was called Housing Density from Tenements to Towers. So the towers part, the tower in the park, is the idea of the demise and decline of public housing, even though in the time that, as you can see in the image, um, towers were public housing towers were getting taller. That is, they were multiplying the number of stories rather than staying close to the ground as they had done. And as you can see, kind of the whole history of public housing in this image of the Lower East Side, where tenements were being converted into public housing projects, mostly under the aegis of the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA. What we did in that exhibition, and Nick did all the history, so that what I'm talking about today is informed by my professor, Nicholas Bloom, and then this collaboration that we did in focusing on density, urban density. And this show was intended to contrast public housing and private market housing historically, so going back into the 1920s, and showing projects. This is a view of the gallery that we're in right now when it was featuring the housing density show. But in order to signal and analyze the approach to urban density and housing density in the NYCHA projects, and then contrast them to the private market solutions, which were much, much more dense. We made this graphic that showed the building massing, the footprint on the ground. So you could see the ground coverage, which is one way of measuring density compared to the amount of space in the site. And then the number of people that you see in the lower section, the number of people in the dwelling units of these particular projects. And what we I suppose, discovered, because we were doing this through a kind of consistent analysis across NYCHA projects from the 1930s and through the 1960s, is that NYCHA's density never changed, even though that is, its people per square acre was consistent from the 1930s to 1960s at a very low density, at about 275 people on average per acre, even if they were in 6-story buildings or if they were in 30-story buildings. What we discovered is that the density remained the same, whether it was a 6-story building or a 30-story building. That's because the buildings occupied less ground on the site, so that the average density, what allowed for, in tall towers, more open space around. But the most important thing about NYCHA projects, and which we think is applicable to social policy going forward, is that NYCHA sites have extremely low density compared to Manhattan, compared to private housing in Manhattan. So there was a social policy implication, we thought, from our analysis, and it got some discussion. It's deeply embedded in my belief about how to move forward with housing, and it got some attention from the New York Times and an article by Michael Kimmelman. So the museum really does strive to do relevant research to current projects, as well as to direct our attention at history. And of course, this was a historical exhibition. So I'm going to introduce properly Howard in a moment, but I just want to show you a couple of Nick Bloom's books in order to validate his authority for the public housing. So and as well as this perspective, public housing that worked, New York in the 20th century, and then a book that he put together, editing with Matt Lasner and a host of other writers on individual projects called Affordable Housing in New York, which is also a kind of history, but a compendium. So Howard Husock has this new book, and because he has such a golden, stellar CV, I want to read a little bit of some of his credits in the past, because now he's a senior fellow in domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. But he was also formerly a vice president of policy research at the Manhattan Institute, where he was also the director of Civil Society Initiative. He was an editor, contributing editor of City Journal. Some of you read his articles there. And he's the author of quite a few books. I'm not going to name all of those. But also of great interest to me as an architectural historian and art historian, kind of a visual, hierarchy of values, I suppose. He was nominated actually and by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate, as if those things happen anymore in the current environment, back in 2013 to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And part of the reason that he did that is that he had been a producer of documentaries with WGBH in Boston. And some of those television series were Community Disorder, Racial Violence in Boston, the Patterson Project, One City in the Reagan Era, Pat Ewing and the American Dream, et cetera, et cetera. So Howard has an incredible background of looking at urban problems and to see them with a clear eye. So what he's going to do in the shape of the evening is to summarize the book a little bit for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll put two chairs in the front for a conversation between him and Nick, because I know from the whole series of questions that Nick sent us earlier this week that there are very trenchant and challenging questions, and the conversation I think will be very active and informative.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thanks for inviting me to this public museum. I've been here before, and it's still great. And it's a pleasure to be here with Nick Bloom, whose work I cite a great deal in my own book. And in some ways, I agree with him. There was a time when public housing worked in New York, so we're not at odds. But my emphasis is a little different. My emphasis in the projects, for me, it was kind of a mystery. How did public housing start in the first place? And I frame that as a mystery because it's so anomalous in the context of housing in the United States. You know, Franklin Roosevelt, under whose aegis, New Deal aegis, public housing began, was on record as saying he saw the United States as a nation of small homeowners. And we are. 60+% own our own homes. The idea of government-owned, managed housing is just out of character with the United States history of housing. And so how did that happen? That was really what I started to chew on. And I was surprised to learn that there was not a grassroots movement among, say, slum dwellers. And we live in terrible conditions, freeze our rent or something like that. No, we want upgraded housing and we demand it. No, it was a movement led by intellectuals. And I would say even go so far as to say bohemian intellectuals. And the starting point, surprisingly, is to me at the Museum of Modern Art. And the Museum of Modern Art in 1934 staged an exhibit called the Housing Exhibition of New York City. And was accompanied by the 89-page exhibition catalog that was really a series of essays making the case for public housing. And a group of intellectuals led by a woman named Catherine Bauer, a Vassar College graduate who had never worked for real estate, never worked in government, had hung out on the left bank of Paris in the 20s, and was an acolyte of, guess who? Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier, the Swiss-French architect, had this vision that Catherine Bauer absorbed of La vie radiante, the radiant city. A city without streets. That's how you get to little density, is Le Corbusier's city without streets. Towers set in a large campus. Not only a campus without streets, but a campus without businesses, without industry, without retailers. That was the vision that Bauer and others were key in this exhibition absorbed and sought to promote. And that's the exhibit in 1934. They envisioned these kind of apartments. This was literally staged by Masons. Right, product placement in a museum show. And the extraordinary thing is just how successful they were. By 1937, 3 years after the housing exhibition made the case that the private housing market would fail 2/3 of the population. That was their case. Lewis Mumford, the famous social critic, private housing would never work because the capitalist system would never produce adequate housing. I'm not hyperbolizing, that's his language. They believed that housing for the working man, they envisioned it for the working man, that's really crucial. They didn't believe that you needed public housing for those of lowest income. No, it was for the working class. They were going to pay the rent. The United States Housing Authority, created by Roosevelt in 1937, 3 years after the exhibition, in an act partially written by Catherine Bauer, who was the mainstay of the housing exhibition. They would float bonds to build the buildings, but then the rents of the tenants, who would be working class people, would provide the financial wherewithal to maintain the buildings. And we know, of course, that has proven to be difficult over time, as New York City Housing Authority today faces an estimated $78 billion in deferred maintenance. So what got these reformers, bourgeois bohemian reformers, I would go so far as to call them, so riled up? Well, they believed that housing was not being provided adequately, but they hated the slums. They thought the Lower East Side was the worst. They're still in the thrall of Jacob Riis, how the everybody's living in hovels there, with dank outhouses, shared bathrooms at best, right? The slums, not only did public housing need to be built, the slums needed to be demolished. Eliminate crimes through slum demolition. And that's what they did. Through the New York Demolition Commission, headed by, guess who? Robert Moses. Right, so some of us see Moses as the bad guy. Moses, to me, was the implementer of these reformers' plans. He was great at implementing, whether it was beaches or parks or public housing. At the zenith of the zeal to demolish the slums, to make way for public housing, Moses was tearing down, here in New York City, 60 buildings a month, ultimately displacing 200,000 people who would ultimately be relocated, but not right away. To a great degree, several chapters in my book, I would say, are a defense of these so-called slums for what we lost. This is a neighborhood that was leveled in Pittsburgh called The Hill. The Hill is very famous. If you've seen the plays of August Wilson, the greatest playwright, probably the greatest American playwright of the 20th century, Jitney, Fences, on and on, right? He lived in the Hill, and his plays are all set in the Hill. The Hill was a thriving neighborhood, right? The idea that these were derelict places saw the slums only through a very limited prism. This is a core point in my book. The limited prism of select physical conditions. What did they ignore? What Paul Jones, a columnist for the African American newspaper in Pittsburgh, the Courier Journal, wrote. They didn't see the churches, they didn't see the nightclubs, they didn't see the baseball fields, they didn't see civil society. They wiped it out, and they moved poor people and disproportionately Black people into public housing, where ownership is an impossibility. In the Hill, in the Black Bottom neighborhood of Detroit, in DeSoto Carr, in St. Louis, in Bronzeville, in Chicago, there were significant degrees of private property ownership. Right? These are disregarded by those who all slumlords running these parasitically preying on the poor. Well, no. There were owner occupants and a high degree, from my research from the census that's in the book, of what I call owner presence. Small landlords owning 2 and 3 family homes where they live too. This was a way for poor people, working class people, to accumulate wealth. When their neighborhoods were demolished, they lost that capacity because in public housing, only the government owns it. No small businesses, no churches. One of the churches taken in Detroit, the New Bethel AME, where the minister was the Reverend C.L. Franklin. Yes, his daughter was Aretha Franklin. And her song, Why I Sing the Blues, includes a protest about public housing. And so this is the V Radiant, the Radiant City. This is the Columbia Point housing project in Boston before it was demolished. In 1949, Harry Truman made the case for 800,000 public housing units across the country. And they came damn close through this combination of slum clearance, eminent domain, and bonded financing. But by 1973, Richard Nixon went on nationwide television to talk about public housing. I used to work in public television. I got confused. Although now they got rid of public television. To declare what was sold as a moratorium on new projects, but ended up basically being the end of new public housing construction for all intents and purposes. That was 3 years. This is DeSoto Carr in St. Louis before it was torn down. This is Domino's in the Hill. And this is 1972, the demolition of, this is the most iconic picture, in some ways trite, but still iconic, the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing project in St. Louis, which really signaled, it was started to demolish about 20 years after it was built and won modern architecture awards. Designed by the Japanese architect Yamasaki, who also designed the World Trade Center, Starbucks, right? This had been 33 11-story high-rises. The social engineers were very cute. They had staggered stop elevators. They only stopped on the odd-numbered floors because they had this theory that people would mingle in the stairwells when they went up and down. Tell that to the NYPD policeman who got killed on a stairwell in case of mistaken identity in a night shift luncheon. Crime infested stairwells, notorious. There was also an incredible impetus toward race segregation. Another theme in my book. So now we think of public housing, we think of the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. Here they are. This is the Frederick Douglass homes in Detroit, before both of those were torn down. We think of them as associated with the big cities. There are 3,000 housing authorities in the country, 200 in the deep south. And in fact, that was the price of passing housing legislation. Senator Stegall of Alabama says, I'm not voting for anything that only helps the Northeast with my tax money. We want these construction contracts for our local contractors. But they came with a price. Racially mixed neighborhoods were slums. They were torn down, replaced by racially segregated public housing projects, including the very first one where Franklin Roosevelt himself cut the ribbon, the Techwood houses in Atlanta. He turned on the lights there. There was a white housing project with Techwood houses and a black housing project, University houses. Similarly in Detroit, where Eleanor Roosevelt came to cut the ribbon on the Frederick Douglass houses. She was a great proponent of public housing, and she thought she was doing African Americans a great favor by not excluding them from this wonderful bounty that would be public housing. So again, by 73, Nixon had declared the moratorium. Oh, this is a lovely drawing of a neighborhood in Fulton, in Roanoke, Virginia, where an outside Irishman, David Ramey, drew from his memory all these kind of graphics of the neighborhood that was torn down. He's been in museum exhibitions. And so we've continued to try to tinker with the formula. Maybe there's some way we can get it right. We'll have mixed income housing because everybody who wanted to leave public housing basically did and became concentrations of the poorest. That's a long and more complicated story, but that's what happened. And so we started to bet on this idea of mixed income. Looks good at first, we'll see how it stands up. People tend to sort on the basis of income. All our neighborhoods are sorted that way. Whether public housing can defy that gravity remains to be seen, but there aren't very many of these anyhow. But the hangover from public housing, I would argue, remains. 876,000 public housing units still. Their follow-up housing choice vouchers, 2.5 million. They've led to their own concentrations of poverty, where Barbara Mikulski, a Democratic congresswoman from Baltimore, said, horizontal ghettos, not vertical ones. There are almost as many housing choice voucher units in New York as there are public housing, and still 177,000 here. And I would argue that the legacy extends even further. As someone who really believes that the best way to create the affordable housing we definitely need in this country is through housing density, but not necessarily apartment building. It can be row houses, it can be 3-family houses, as many units on a small lot as possible. But we know that suburbs zone that out. We know that Greenwich has 2-acre zoning. We know that you couldn't build the 100,000 small ranch houses of San Jose in Silicon Valley today because of this exclusionary zoning. I would argue that what's happened is anything that even smacks of low-income housing lives under the shadow of the failure of public housing. And it gets communities scared. Maybe that's not fair. Maybe they shouldn't be like that, but I think they are. And so, in summary, there was a misapprehension about the slums. We built government housing that denied its occupants the choice to own their own dwelling and to have businesses and civil society institutions. The whole craze, if you will, lasted only about 25 years, so Richard Nixon stopped it. Nixon gave this speech, which was poignant. He expressed his deep concern that those living in the projects are socially isolated. Language you wouldn't expect from Richard Nixon. But here we are today, still needing to pick up the pieces and figure out what to make of what we did and how to build the housing community. So thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming, and thanks. That was a great presentation, and I enjoyed the book a great deal. Not only because I was cited in very flattering ways, but I mean that's fun. But I you know, I have at least one of my students here who knows that I do kind of play devil's advocate a lot in my courses, even though I am known for talking about public housing a lot and so forth. And so I always kind of push. And so I enjoyed the contrarian, almost sort of element of the book for sure. That's terrific. I shared some of my sort of thoughts on the book with Howard, and
He warned me.
I did. I have like these very long questions, but they got me thinking. So I'll read my question, but they're sort of my statement-ish question, and then Howard will have an opportunity to discuss with me. So glad you're all here, and you're certainly welcome to ask questions too. So I guess we'll start. You started out even tonight talking about the roots of this with Catherine Bauer, who definitely shapes a lot in the book and this important exhibit that was done. But I mean, my feeling is you might be a little too hard on people like Bauer, because I think when you read the book, which you should, is that
Her book, Modern Housing.
Actually, even yours too.
Oh,
okay. Yours, yeah. But I'd say I definitely recommend Modern Housing too. A very interesting piece as well. But I think many of the program design failures you critique, which you also did tonight, were a little beyond her control, like such as limitations on unit cost, which created a sort of quality or affect of the developments themselves, the income limits, the lack of retail, the requirements for slum clearance, and the absence of, for instance, a lot of them wanted cooperatives, for instance, and so forth. My reading of the history is because I guess I'm a little more sort of into the social policy and the political histories that sort of come after this, is that the key legislation, the Housing Acts of 37, 49, 54, were shaped as much by the real estate industry, conservative Democrats, and Republicans as liberal housers in the New Deal liberal Democrats who you talked about. The limits on income and unit costs, for instance, were welcomed by real estate, which really genuinely feared a major challenge, right? That they would become like Great Britain or somewhere like that. So it had to be for this poorest group. Or the slum clearance requirements were not necessarily just humanitarian, but were actually offered in part as a public buyout of owners of basically uneconomic properties such as old tenements. In fact, last night I was on a book panel for a new book called The Menace of Prosperity. It was a very interesting book, and basically he argues that public housing, from the left perspective, was really just a bailout for, I don't know, it's a little much, but it was like a bailout for, property owners, and they were happy to have eminent domain take their property because there had been such this like enormous building boom in the 1920s. And there is some language of that in the records. So I would say that these people like Bauer, for better or worse, they sought more diverse income groups, more decentralized projects. Like they're very interested on building on the periphery, right? That was one of their big things, improved design, but ultimately accepted what they could within the American political context. Here's your question. That was long up there, but can we really blame housing reformers for all the program failures? After all, legislation is usually always a compromise. I mean, we'll see going forward, but I think that's how I kind of look at the political system.
A lot of good points. To the extent that I blame the reformers, they let the genie out of the bottle. And they gave it the imprimatur of intellectuals and elites. So not only were reformers on the guiding committee, the curators, if you will, of the MoMA exhibit, but so was Mrs. Arthur Ox Sulzberger. She had a name, but she was just Mrs. The wife of the publisher of the New York Times. Governor Lehman was on there. Elites of all backgrounds were on the guiding committee. There was nobody representing the Lower East Side on this. Nobody. So I think they let the genie out of the bottle. Then, did they lose control of it? Yeah, sure. I think that's fair. And at the same time as bailout for tenements, there's a wonderful book called The Decorated Tenement.
I assigned section of it. I adore that book. Yes.
And his point there, remind me who the author is.
Zachary Violet. Zachary Violet, yeah.
Right.
Great book.
There was a self-improvement going on, competing for slightly less poor people as their prospects improved, with better foyers, decorations, things that signaled that this was a slightly higher class building. So, and in the records, and I cited in the book of the Slum Clearance Committee, a letter to Moses by an owner on the Lower East Side, putting the word slum in quotes, saying basically, how dare you take my building? You're calling it a slum. I've just invested this much in it. So were there some who welcomed a buyout? Yeah, probably. I think there is definitely the genie of crony capitalism was let loose by this too, though. And that is where the real estate industry does come in.
The construction firms that were in the 30s for
that's why Roosevelt went along with it.
Yeah.
He didn't necessarily like the idea of government managed housing. 1937, we're in the Second Depression, and he thought this would jumpstart the construction industry. That's what sold it to FDR. But every small town in the South had its own contractors, and suddenly there was a payday for that.
Right.
So was there a confluence of interests? Yes, but I think the reformers let the genie out of the bottle.
So, all right. So I think you also were very poignant in your presentation about the loss of social capital. And I think that's, if you read your book, which I think people should, you can read about definitely the clearance of neighborhoods, the loss of social capital resulting from public housing redevelopment. However, colleagues like Joseph Heathcott, who's at the New School, argue that projects like Pruitt-Igoe failed as much due to contextual collapse as to any design or tenanting features.
Is that like intersectionality?
I don't. Which part?
Contextual collapse.
I don't
know what that means. That's what I'm saying.
I'll get to it. I'll just find it.
Okay.
But anyway, this is if you get our book Public Housing Myths, which we did, he's got a great article on this. So his argument is the following for contextual collapse. New York public housing was more successful for longer. We can debate whether it is today the same level of success because the city, New York City as a whole, doesn't fall as hard as a St. Louis, Detroit, and some sections of Chicago due to decentralization. You know, factors like the car culture, which really begins unforced in the 1920s, relocation of factories to the suburbs and the South, mass suburbanization, the Sun Belt, market forces and historical accidents that have maintained the New York City central business district. I mean, even, there's an article, I think yesterday in the Times, New York's CBD is back or whatever,
Wall Street Journal.
Very lucky. Oh, so I'm sorry. Lucky, it was the journal, yeah. So that, New York has had this kind of good fortune, right? Many times to have basically a more robust mixed economy over the years. So it's worth considering whether any housing program could survive in a collapsing city, right? The crisis in public housing was often exceeded in scale many times over by the abandonment and social disorder in surrounding neighborhoods. And as a Baltimorean, right, where public housing was actually very small, it's an extraordinarily concentrated and small program compared to the vastness of like a West Baltimore and East Baltimore in terms of disinvestment. And, the areas that, for instance, were the major focus, for instance, the Rice, the 1960s, were mostly non-public neighborhoods, non-public housing neighborhoods, and retail strips were burned down. So in declining neighborhoods like this, social capital and local stores have failed spectacularly in the long term, largely due to these, and this would be Joseph's also argument, decentralization, deindustrialization, redlining, much of which was driven, I would argue, by factors beyond simple government policy. In sum, well, that was just the one, again, but anyway, I'm thinking through these things. But in sum, could any housing program, even a perfectly managed and funded one, have survived the post-war urban crisis? And, okay, I'll stop it. I'll let you answer that.
Right.
I'll stop.
I'm going to try to make 2 points.
You go ahead.
One is one I don't think you will have heard before. That in terms of contextual
collapse, contextual collapse.
I believe that public housing helped its surrounding neighborhoods decline. Here's my point. Suddenly you're owning an older building, you're struggling to maintain it, maybe you rent out floors 2 and 3. Maybe your extended family lives in this building, but maybe you've got a tenant who helps you pay the note. Suddenly the government is competing with you big time. Suddenly there's a brand new apartment building that has, in the post-war era, refrigerators, gas stoves. None of that was common. Indoor plumbing, maybe. You're facing really what amounts to unfair competition from the government. And so those neighborhoods get worse and worse. And as you lose the petty bourgeois class in that neighborhood, the small landlords, yeah, then there's less social capital, more disorder. So that's one point that I don't think is generally made. Number two, as far as the collapsing cities, there's no doubt that Chicago, St. Louis, Buffalo, Detroit, my hometown of Cleveland, suffered disproportionately. But again, by tearing down the neighborhoods that public housing replaced, you eliminate a class of property owners, you eliminate the potential for private investment. So I would still maintain that public housing, could you have tweaked it in this way or that? Could it have fought against, the move to the suburbs? I don't think public housing could, but I do think older neighborhoods might have been rediscovered. They might have been fixed up. I mean, the combination of public housing and the Chrysler Freeway, that was deadly. There's no doubt about that. But I still think public housing, qua public housing, was an original city planning scheme.
Oh, yeah, I think there were the slum clearance components of it for sure. It's just for me, it's sort of that question of, and more, and Joseph Heathcote, because I actually don't, this is more of his proposal, right? Is that if you draw back from like your book is very focused on the projects, right? And so, and mine too. Right. I mean, it's a critique of also my work in that way, which focuses on management and those kinds of issues for years. But
Although I
his
have a
point
chapter called The
is-
Golden Age, which is
Yeah.
pays tribute to you.
So, but there is this broader, he's working on St. Louis, for instance, right? And so he's looking at like this broader question, like, okay, Pruitt-Igoe, when you take as a percentage of urban land, even if you talk about its impact on its surrounding neighborhoods, but it's just such a vast areas of basically deindustrialization. That's his argument. And so if you took something like public housing formed at MoMA, as this kind of like bohemian arty, right? Like, or, Pruitt-Igoe, this super avant-garde building, right? And you plop it in the middle of a city that is basically, going through massive collapse. And the Pruitt-Igoe myth, it was sort of similar. The film sort of took this proposal too, that, it's hard to imagine anything really kind of works out. We can leave that.
Well,
Go ahead. I'll let you
I guess the
respond.
point I'm making is, would there be a cycle of regeneration with dispersed ownership and plans? Jane Jacobs, of whom I can try to consider myself an acolyte, said, new ideas need old buildings.
It's fair.
And so we don't know what the counterintuitive, the counterfactual is of what would have happened to those neighborhoods.
It forecloses by clearance, whatever it was for urban renewal or highways or public housing, it foreclosed a rebirth in those areas because you've essentially cleared that neighborhood.
And you've frozen it in place.
Right. Well, I have just a follow-up here. Because you do accuse, which it's legit, them of Bauer and the crowd, right, of being super idealistic, right, and utopian, right? But I'll push back, I'll flip it. Is it somewhat utopian today to believe we can kind of go back to the vibrant urban neighborhoods as they existed a century ago by the government getting out of the housing business? So we have this mass like disinvestment. It's like the genie is out of the bottle, right? So how do you, and I see it's a legit question. How do you rebuild, let's say, beyond kind of like the Hope Six and things like that? How do you get back to those vibrant neighborhoods again?
Well, that's only tangentially to do with public housing, really.
It's a big part of your book that's the better. That's the better.
It is the
model
better.
of life.
And so, I would argue there's two questions there. One is, what do we do with the public
might be
housing that we
both.
still have? That's a core question for New York. We've got 177,000 units of public housing on 335 campuses today. Maybe 8% of the population is living in public housing. Maybe it's 10%. We don't really know.
That's true.
So what do we do with that? Let's bracket that and we can talk about it. But I think the only answer is to rezone at a higher level of density. So I happen to be a big fan. I wrote another book called The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It. I'm a big fan of the Nehemiah houses in Brooklyn and the South Bronx. But small ownership. In fact, a lot of people moved from public housing into the Nehemiah projects, working class people. But I still think they were way too not dense. They were trying to create a suburb within the city. What's the point of that? They're all set on their own little yards and lots. No, we need to build more dense 2, 3, 4 family buildings close together. Affordability, what I call naturally occurring affordable housing, is based in as many units as possible on the same amount of land.
So
not the low density of nature. So I'm a fan of, Eric Adams did a lot of things wrong and he got run out on a rail in effect, but I think his City of Yes is a great idea.
So basically, if we come back, then we take that kind of back to public housing sites that have been cleared. In your view, it would go back to sort of like the 19th century land sale. Like the best model might be to subdivide, like Nehemiah, right? Is basically not try another social experiment like Hope Six or something like that.
Right.
You would essentially kind of like, auction the land at some level, right? And rezone it, right, for higher density. You wouldn't keep, although a lot of them have higher density anyway, right? They preserve that, but basically you would have like a land auction and then you'd allow people to come in and kind of do their thing.
Well, I wrote a long essay, and I think I said it in this book, I forget, called Restreeting the Projects. So as Carol pointed out, the projects are not dense. They were the Radiant City, a campus, a city without streets. They need streets.
So part of it would be basically bringing back the streets and sidewalks and so forth.
Well, building new streets, cutting through the projects, creating new frontage. Sure, auction off that land, have small homes, create a neighborhood, and house the projects in this new neighborhood that's built on these new streets with corner stores, walkable areas. You know, when Jane Jacobs was running for Fortune, she went to Philadelphia to see the new urban renewal and public housing there, and she met with Edmund Bacon, who was the Robert Moses of Philadelphia. Yes, he was Kevin Bacon's father, 1 degree of separation. And she said, he takes her on and says, "It's beautiful." She says, "Beautiful, Edmund. Where are all the people?" And that was it. And so by cutting streets through, in answer to the question of how do we get back to this, you know, maybe mythical age that I'm painting, I think you can do it by building lots of small houses on this empty land in the project.
And also, for instance, doing things like allowing for commercial development.
Absolutely commercial development.
So that's why you like City of Yes is a little more flexibility built into those kinds of uses and things like that.
Well, the modern housers wanted to separate industry, business, and residential. Why? Who doesn't want to walk to a corner store? I wrote a paper for the Management Institute about food deserts in public housing. Lots of public housing projects are food deserts.
I will say that I'll be doing 2 tours for Open House New York at Harlem River Houses. And
Which is being renovated now.
Yeah, it's very nicely renovated, but it also had stores. And when the first PWA projects were done, there was more of a little more. There's definitely more of
Pre-1949,
Yeah.
Moses himself excluded the stores, partly because merchants didn't want competition.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see, which would be a good. Was the best follow-up. All right, so we do have a European-style social housing program in the United States, I would say, and it's known as Mitchell-Lama. It's a New York, as you know, a New York-based program. We should discuss whether state programs like these, because obviously there's a lot for you haven't read the book, but you know a lot on federal policy here for sure. So, is there something better both about the federalist kind of element of it? But also programs like these offer both, even today, a lot of state programs are really rental ownership, some mix of rental, ownership, and of course the Mitchell-Lama cooperative model to basically lower middle and middle class groups of people. Would those meet your standard for a quality subsidized housing program? After all, the subsidies, there are subsidies, but compared to public housing, they're nothing. The housing has been maintained to the present. And behavioral norms are pretty strong for that. What's your feeling about Mitchell?
I guess my question is, why subsidize these people? You know, I'm always hit with, what about the mortgage interest deduction? I say, yeah, get rid of it. It's basically going anyhow.
You are on the libertarian side of this thing.
On that issue, not on many issues. You know, but I mean, with the 2017 Tax Act, 93% of people don't itemize it. Mortgage interest deduction is gone.
Yeah.
And were we subsidizing the middle class? Yeah. Was that a good thing? No. Did it actually raise housing prices? Yeah. Right? Because you could deduct. But I don't, the Mitchell-Lama was part of that urban crises mode where, oh, we have to keep the middle class in the city. And so we'll pay them off. We'll subsidize their housing. Well, why should we care if they move to Long Island? You know, why don't, you know, other people will take their place in other neighborhoods will be built. And you know, when Bill de Blasio kept talking about 200,000 units built or preserved, he meant he had to pay Mitchell-Lama owners for the expiring use provisions. That is, they were going to go out of affordability unless they got another infusion of money.
So let's follow this. I like this road you're going down. Let's keep going down this road.
All right.
All right. So if there isn't a subsidized middle, and I would argue actually true, even a lot of the new affordable is essentially like a subsidized housing for middle income families. Like if you look at a lot of the LIHTC, low income housing tax credit programs, because they have such high income levels that are allowed. So what kind of city, because the argument back then for Mitchell-Lama and programs like that were that you wanted a middle class in the city. You didn't want just people who are very poor living in the city, either in tenements and public housing, or the very wealthy. So it is a different urban vision you're kind of putting out there. So basically the middle class of the city would basically come in on trains and so forth.
May or may not. You know, Now we're supposed to be so concerned about gentrification. It turns out the middle class rediscovered the city. They took a snapshot. There's this, what I call the snapshots fallacy, the snapshot of the slums that were going to be the perennial sentence for the people living there. The snapshot of the city in 1968 that meant, flight of the middle class was going to continue forever. Those things didn't continue forever. And it's a fallacy for government to intervene to try to Photoshop the city.
Okay, so I guess it's a hot no on the Mitchell as a mom.
It's nice.
It's funny because
Nice for the people who are living there.
Everyone dislikes Mitchell except like the people who have the apartments or something like that.
And you mentioned low-income housing tax credit. We're talking $700,000 a unit. That's crazy.
Well, that's California. It's down there. All right. So let's discuss that since you actually brought up a little bit on zoning, but there isn't a lot of zoning in the book.
No, it's a different. That poor side of town. My previous book has extensive stuff about zoning. I'm prepared.
All right. That's fine. But so zoning is a form of local government regulation.
It is.
Where it has shaped the placement of public and multifamily housing, which has dramatically impacted the fortunes of public housing, I think, mostly for the worse, in my opinion. What role do you see zoning as having in public housing fortunes? And is zoning reform, which you already brought up, which might unlock private sector activity, a way to improve housing quality for all? You kind of answered that, but go ahead and dive into the zoning.
The combination of government ownership and zoning really creates a lot of ill consequences. Yonkers is a great example of this. And there was a federal lawsuit about the placement of public housing. So you have public housing and you have government controlling what can be built where. Yonkers used it to racially segregate. That's a big theme in my book, is that public housing enabled racial segregation. And, so the combination of local control and public housing was not a good one. And on the other hand, we can't wish away local control of housing. We have the Housing and Urban Development Department. They don't make housing policy.
What is this? There's a department still?
Housing, yeah, right.
I don't think there was. Let's use the past tense.
Yeah, they got riffed just last week, more of them. I was there the other week. That is the worst building you'll ever go into in your life. It's worse than
Thinking of bohemian brutalist.
Brutalist.
What?
It's high brutalist. But
We're back to zone.
The HUD doesn't make housing policy for the country. 18,000 municipalities make housing policy. Every local planning board and zoning board makes housing policy. And so our challenge is somehow, notwithstanding the perhaps misplaced fear of lower income people in higher income areas, is to persuade those local boards that they need. We won't call it low income housing. We'll call it workforce housing. We'll call it missing middle housing.
Multifamily house.
No, don't
No,
call it that.
What's wrong with multifamily? What did I miss? Yeah, interesting.
It's like I was talking to an environmental group the other day about something where we have shared interest in this. And we're going to advocate for preserving our area by saying to follow the science. I said, no, don't say follow the science. Because yes, you should follow science, but people take offense to that now. It's crazy. So similarly, low income housing of any kind, multifamily, those are code words.
They have them
for towers in the park. So we have to somehow skirt those kind of reactions. And the example I use in the book is Levittown as naturally occurring affordable housing. Levittown, anybody here grew up in Levittown? Or ever been to Levittown? It was a potato field in 1945. And William Levitt went to the Hempstead Town Board of Supervisors and said, I would like to build 17,000 houses here. They go away. He came back a little while later with about 1,000 veterans who were living with their in-laws in Brooklyn and said, we want out of here. And we are willing to put down payments on a 750 square foot house. 750 square foot is, how big is this room, Carol? It's
3,500 visible.
Right. People were living in small places with no basements, no attics. They could add those attics, and they did. But they were willing to put down their down payments By the way, Levitt also racially segregated, and he later admitted that was a terrible mistake. It was a terrible mistake because people of different races but similar incomes get along well. And by excluding, he made a terrible mistake. But he built great affordable housing because he persuaded the zoning board of Hempstead that it was okay. Because he created an attractive group. And so what's the attractive group for, Stamford, Greenwich?
A march of teachers and firefighters or something.
Teachers, firefighters.
That's
You need EMTs to answer the call when I fall and I don't get up, all those baby boomers, I think that's a winning argument, but somebody's got to make it.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I do think the zoning reform movement could do more of that. I think that's a fair, because there is this widespread zoning reform in certain states.
Yeah,
But I
but-
think, I think they could do more of kind of like highlighting the people who would benefit from.
Yeah, and if you own a big house in a suburb, well, you need somebody to buy that house someday when you're ready to
Yeah,
step
that would
down,
be a good idea.
and so if you have a class of people, maybe your kids who
Mhm.
can live in town, there's emotional arguments that might break down the strictures of zoning.
By the way, when you mentioned Levittown and you said that they've created affordable housing, I thought, oh, because they're renting out the basements everywhere. I swore that was what you were gonna say. And
Well,
because that allows,
there is a lot of renting out of garages
Right.
in ranch houses in Long Island now.
So, I mean, it kind of comes back to that question of allowing or sort of turning away, not looking, right? When people actually decide how they're going to use their property.
Yeah, well, the basement apartments in New York, which are having a moment now,
Right.
200,000 of them. And it would be so important to legalize them in terms of creating more housing density, both because you want to make them safe.
Yeah.
But second of all, if they're legal, then that's a form of wealth appreciation for those owners when they go to the bank
Right.
to buy their next house.
Or to
I have
sell, or to
2
sell
units.
their, or to sell their.
Or to sell their house. When it's illegal, they're denied that
Yeah.
access.
So, the book does cover the full sort of, a whole series of different, it's not just public housing, right? There's stuff on Hope 6, which is the public housing redevelopment
Vouchers.
program. There's on vouchers. So let's get into the vouchers then. Because you're kind of tough on Section 8, which, and the voucher programs, which I thought was a little bit odd because I thought,
Concerns are supposed to be for vouchers.
exactly right. It addresses many of your concerns about poverty concentration. Pretty much most of the money goes to the private sector. So, but am I right in thinking you're okay with a voucher program as a short-term limited benefit rather than this kind of like panacea, right? That some people have proposed, right? This long-term solution. So what's your
I mean,
feeling?
I don't know if I would have invented it in the first place, but we've got it. 2.5 million vouchers, 5.9 million people living in
And
it.
it's a very expensive, people don't realize the expense of this program.
It's by
enormous.
far the majority of the budget of the Housing and
Right.
Urban Development
Right.
Department. It's basically a safety net agency
Mhm.
that we don't understand is playing that role. We spend much more on housing choice vouchers, AKA Section 8, than we do on cash welfare now, much more. And there's no time limit.
Mhm.
So yeah, I would want it to be transitional housing. And this is true both for public housing and for voucher housing. I think all the rent should be flat. Anybody who rents a place, who would rent an apartment where the more you earn, the more your rent is? But that's the deal we give to the poor.
Right, but and I would say that was not something necessarily the housing reformers wanted, but it was something they agreed to in order to make sure, for instance, that over-income people wouldn't just sort of like enjoy like a very cheap apartment in New York. And
Yeah.
it pushed out all those like over-income people.
Yeah, but it was the 1969 amendment to the Housing Act because of Pruitt-Igoe. The Pruitt-Igoe tenants, the Pruitt-Igoe Housing Authority realized, wait, this place is falling apart. What should we do to get more money? Raise the rent. That was the original formula. The tenants by that time so poor said, we can't afford, they went on a rent strike.
When?
They went on a rent strike.
Right.
And the Senate, led by Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, the first black senator since Reconstruction, said, you're right, and we'll limit your rent to 25% of income. That put a tourniquet on the revenue of housing authorities and led to their going down the toilet.
So we have time for one more question, Carol.
Well, so that's why I want to fix the rents. so people can save money even when they earn more,
Yeah,
and then move up and out.
I definitely feel like that was, and in my book too, I talk about that. About after, not long after they had pushed out a lot of their over-income tenants in NYCHA, they were like, maybe that wasn't a great idea.
Yeah.
They didn't really have a choice because of the federal rules, but it's very interesting. So we have time for one more question.
Okay,
And
you're not gonna let the audience?
for us,
Oh, okay.
for us.
All right.
What do we do, Howard, it's a big country now. We got 330 odd million people in it, right? What do we do about the millions of hard to house people in this country? Many are suffering on the streets and shelters, mass transit, libraries, and they don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. So what is sort of the vision when you have not just like, a few 100,000 or a few thousand a city, like what do you do when you have millions of people, right? And you have basically in our era, right, a declining subsidy programs, right, and so forth. What would we do?
Well, I'm not sure if the street homeless is in the millions.
No.
I mean,
But overall, the hard to house. We know a lot of people are doubled up and so forth.
see, I think doubled up is okay. That's life, huh? And I once lived in a house across the street from a plumber who had 8 kids and they had 4 to a bedroom, that's life. You save money. People on the street, that's a different matter. I think homelessness is actually an Orwellian term in the context of Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, which is all about creating terms that are actually embedded arguments. Right? Homelessness implies that the problem of the guys, who I see in Penn Station and now even in Moynihan Station, with all their belongings in a heap, that their problem is housing. I don't believe that that's true. Are they unhoused? Yes. I think we have an epidemic that is the hangover from deinstitutionalization, substance abuse, mental illness. In 1955, California had 50,000 beds in mental health facilities. Today there's 5,000. And we should not be surprised that there's giant tent cities in Los Angeles.
So commitment as part of this would take care of a lot of the most visible.
We wouldn't need a system that big. The old mental hospital system included a lot of the elderly poor before there was proper Social Security, SSI, and Medicare and Medicaid. It was essentially over the hill to the poorhouse. They were the poorhouse. There were a lot of people suffering from end-stage syphilis. That's not a thing anymore.
We also didn't have the same kind of pharmaceutical treatments and things.
All that stuff. So you could have a replacement series, and we must have, Ezekiel Emanuel, who invented Obamacare, he's for this. Reinvent the psychiatric institution. It's a liberal conservative consensus. And before we assume that the private housing market is going to fail people en masse, like the reformers did, we ought to replace our mental health system, having abandoned it.
Well, question time.
Okay.
Would single room occupancy hotels, which used to be a thing, or rooming houses, would they be a part of a solution?
Yeah, I'm all for SROs. I think New York banned them in 1966 and tore down 100,000 units. And you had somebody at the door making sure the wrong people didn't get in. They were flop houses. They were derided as flop houses. They were housing of last resort. I've actually written for Vital City, which is a great new urban site that I urge you to visit. NYCHA is so underoccupied. Right, 30% of NYCHA units have empty bedrooms. Right, it's basically a naturally occurring retirement community. 50% are basically elderly women living alone, and their children have left. So I would subdivide those units. I might create whole floors that are de facto SROs, right? But to make better use of the NYCHA housing that we already have. So out of the box.
Interesting. That's great. And I think my follow-up question to that, because I had
No, she has a question. We have a real question.
But just to follow up on the focus on the SROs is how would I think one of the issues would be like the media play on something like this. Do you think modern media could handle the revival of the SRO? Because partly it's that Jacob Riis kind of thing.
There was a program in San Diego to build SROs. It was somewhat modest but successful. I think if it's framed as, you know, I mean, supportive housing is embraced. It's very expensive. It's not clear that people on the streets want to move into it. You know, you just have to hire the right media.
That's my follow-up.
Is there a last question?
There's a young lady leading in. There she is.
Yeah, so I think one policy is problem not of laws, with I guess, ownership units, so the ones that are, I guess, home ownership.
Co-op, I think.
Yeah, well, alright, is that it is hard for income constrained people to raise enough money to cover maintenance costs. What is, libertarian solution to?
I'm not a libertarian.
I think I may have framed him into a boxing style, so I apologize.
So paint the picture for me. So we have Mitchell Lama and the co-op. It's like a lot of co-op owners who can't afford the maintenance, even in private co-ops.
Yeah.
Or that co-op that collapsed in Miami Beach because they didn't charge people enough to maintain the building. Well, probably they have to sell their co-ops to somebody who can afford them. And so to the extent that, you know, you hear something called permanent affordability, which I oppose, right? Because unless people can appreciate, have the value of their homes appreciate, they're being competed against unfairly by everybody else in the economy. So let them sell the co-ops, you know, at a profit and have somebody move in at a higher price and replace them who can afford to keep it up. Otherwise, you're going to have to subsidize a whole round of renovation ad infinitum.
Which is kind of how places like Co-op City stay in business.
They raise the fees.
They do, but they also get an underlying help from the state government in order to keep the cost of money down for the maintenance and things like that. That's how they are able to deliver affordable
Because of
ownership.
bond financing. Right.
Please, everybody, thank Howard and Nick tonight.
Thank you.
Great.